So, a quickie history of England. How it is that we get from Catholic England in the early 1500s to Protestant England by the late 1500s. So, Henry Tudor defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, bringing to the end several decades of civil war. He intends to put England on the map as a major country. And his plan consists of marrying his various children off to offspring of European monarchs. Arthur, the eldest son and Prince of Wales, who's going to become ultimately King Arthur in theory, is married to Princess Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Unfortunately, he dies 6 months later. Margaret, the eldest daughter, is married to James, who's going to become a future King of Scotland. Henry, the spare son, actually also gets to marry Princess Catherine when he takes over from his father in 1509, though he did need a special papal dispensation, since of course it is considered incest to marry your deceased brother's wife. And then there's Mary, who is married off to Louis XII, the King of France. She actually had been previously betrothed to the person who was going to become the future Holy Roman Emperor. So, powerful dynastic marriages. So let's have a look here at Henry, the second son, who has now actually become King Henry VIII. He's most famous for having 6 wives, but he really ought to be more famous for the person who introduces England to humanism, European systems of education, and all sorts of things like that. But for our purposes, the wives are actually going to be rather important here. He was married to the first wife for 24 years. The other 5 wives were married to him for a combined total of actually only 10 years. So, who are these people? First of all, there's Catherine of Aragon. She has 1 daughter with Henry named Mary, and there will be 5 stillborn children, several of them sons, I'm afraid. There's a long, complicated story about this. Henry wanted to have a son, and because of this, a lot of complicated things happen. Henry ultimately ends up breaking with the Roman Catholic Church because the Pope will not grant him an annulment to the marriage, the Pope having, after all, made a special dispensation to even allow him to marry her in the first place. So he breaks with the Church, he grants himself an annulment so he can remarry. And then the following year actually makes himself the head of the Church of England, which is now going to be a new entity. It's sort of Protestant more than anything else. It looks a lot like the Catholic Church, but it doesn't answer to the Pope, and it doesn't send any money anymore to Rome. Catherine will die in 1536. The next wife is Anne Boleyn. She will have a daughter, Elizabeth, and also a couple of miscarriages, some of them of sons. And this is another long story that is going to be short. Henry declares in 1536 that she has committed adultery and incest with her own brother, and she is executed at the Tower of London in 1536. Now, the third wife, Jane Seymour. Henry had already been fooling around with her when he was still married to Anne Boleyn. She will ultimately produce a son after a miscarriage. The son will be Edward, and he will actually ascend to the throne after Henry. Well, it's actually not that long a story. Henry gets engaged to her the day after Anne is executed. He will marry her a month later, and ultimately, I'm afraid she will die about 2 weeks after the birth of Edward. There are 3 more wives. You don't actually need to know about them for the purpose of this course. So, who succeeds after the death of Henry in 1547? All 3 of his children, one by each of the first 3 wives. First, of course, it will be Edward VI, even though he's the youngest, he's the boy. He will never marry, but what's really significant about him is that he's the one who really transforms the Church of England into a real Protestant denomination. He arranges for the Book of Common Prayer, the standard prayer book still in use actually by the Church of England and by its American affiliate, the Episcopal Church. And a number of doctrines are straightened out at this time period. But he dies fairly young. 1558, his eldest sister, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, comes to the throne. She's married to Philip, the King of Spain. She's actually still Roman Catholic, just as her mother had been. And when she becomes queen, she's going to return England to Roman Catholicism. And of course, being married to the King of Spain, the idea is to kind of consolidate Catholic power. She never actually has any children, nor does, of course, Edward. Elizabeth comes to the throne next. When Mary dies, Elizabeth is declared her successor, having nominally reconverted to Catholicism, which somehow quietly disappears after she comes to the throne. She will ultimately restore the Church of England as the official Church of England. And this is a country where the monarch determines what religion everybody is supposed to be. This idea about freedom of choice and liberty of conscience is not an issue. It's going to become quite a sore point for the next several decades. But there is an official church, and you're expected to be a member of the official church. Okay, in 1603, Elizabeth dies. She never marries. She never has any children. The throne then goes to the Protestant King of Scotland, James Stuart, who's the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And that is the end of the Tudor line. They lasted for only 1 century. Okay, so who's Mary, Queen of Scots? You mainly know her as the person who was executed in 1587. The charge was plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, her cousin, and actually replace her on the throne. Mary had been forced to abdicate as the Queen of Scotland in 1567. Her own people actually threw her out. The country, it's a complicated story, I'm not going into it here. But she has been living in England for 20 years, mainly at her cousin's expense, and she was the center of many, many Catholic plots to try to place her on the English throne. As far as English Catholics were concerned, Elizabeth was illegitimate. She was the daughter of Anne, and therefore was not a proper Catholic marriage, and so they had absolutely no obligation to have any loyalty to her. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been married 3 times. The first time she was married to the King of France, a good, solid Catholic dynastic marriage. When he died, she came back to Scotland. She married a Scotsman, who died mysteriously in an explosion. And the person who seemed to be somewhat involved in this mysterious explosion becomes actually her 3rd husband. The Scots peers want to have nothing to do with this woman after a while, and she's essentially kind of thrown out, and her 1-year-old son James is declared the new King of Scotland. He's Protestant, by the way. The other really big event you need to know about at this time period is actually the year after this, the Spanish Armada. The King of Spain, who you may remember was married to Queen Mary, Elizabeth's predecessor as the monarch of England. He's sending a giant naval fleet solely for the purpose of invading England and taking over the country. The plan is to throw out Elizabeth, take over the country, root out Protestantism, reestablish Roman Catholicism, and also to stop English interference in the Spanish colonies in the Netherlands, which they've acquired through marriage. Now, the Netherlands are very, very strongly Protestant, so being now suddenly Spanish colonies is not going down too well. England, as the closest Protestant country, is constantly sending military assistance to help them in rebellions against their colonial overlords. The Spanish Armada, by the way, had the Pope's blessing. The end result was, for Spain, a complete fiasco, for England, a spectacular victory, in fact. Spain was soundly defeated, and the English actually saw this enormous victory as a sign from God in favor of Protestantism being the one true direction that Christianity should take. One should remember that both Protestants and Catholics are both Christians, just different branches of it. So, why is this important? Well, this is going to actually play into literary texts, in particular the work that we're studying now, The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. 2 years after the Spanish Armada, the first 3 books of The Faerie Queene are published. You're going to notice very strong anti-Catholic feeling, anti-Spanish feeling. There's a reason for that, because these things have been happening very, very recently, so these are very much sore points. And Spenser is part of a very strongly Protestant group of writers at this time period. So I'm hoping this will help fill in a little bit of historical background that will help contextualize some of the things that we read about in The Faerie Queene. The end.